Well, good afternoon. My name is Mark Lepker, and I'm the Director of Education for the National Cryptologic Foundation. And before we get started here with our talk, I just kind of want to give you some opportunities and ground rules for how we're going to be running the talk. I'm going to be introducing our guest speaker, and Miss Laura Nelson, our CEO, is going to be doing kind of an interview with Sally and talking about all of her experiences. So if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section. We'll be also monitoring the chat, but the Q&A is really the best place to drop your questions. And as you provide those, we'll be breaking into Sally with questions for her to answer. So we really appreciate you being here today, and it's a great opportunity to talk today with Sally Botsai, Dr. Botsai. She started working at NSA back in 1957, shortly after she graduated from college. And we're going to look forward to hearing about that experience in her early years at NSA. Her PhD is in international relations that she achieved in 1972. Now, she spent about 12 years in operations before she was selected for a tour as NSA's representative down at the White House Situation Room. A unique experience, and I think this is going to be fun to hear about the real Situation Room. She was NSA's first woman to hold that position. Now, after that 2-year tour, she was asked to come back and be the deputy director of that operation. She held that position until 1976. She also attended the National War College and again was the first NSA woman to do so and graduating in 1977. She's received the Meritorious Civilian Service Award in 76 and the Director's Distinguished Service Medal in 1998. She is the vice chairman of the Board of Association of Former Intelligence Officers. So Sally, welcome today. We're very happy that you're here with us on this cyber chat. And Laura, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. And welcome, Sally. We're so happy to have you with us today. So let's begin with, you've had this wonderful career at the National Security Agency. How did you get recruited to go there? And what did you know about it before you started?
Well, I knew just very little about it, although I learned about NSA from a former classmate in college. And I decided to meet with a recruiter on campus. We did that in those days. We didn't have computers, so recruiters came to campus and I applied and was accepted. And so it started a career that extended for 40 years.
Wow, that's amazing. So what did you know? I mean, as you were entering into that, what did you know about the intelligence community at the time or the National Security Agency? And what did you learn about them as you, in those early days?
Well, I knew a little bit about the major organizations at that time. I had studied for a semester down in Washington in my senior year in college. And although we were not permitted to go to any of the intelligence agencies, I did know a little bit about it. And so when I went back to school for my final semester, I applied for a job.
Oh, I see. So so at that point you didn't know a lot about about the intelligence community, but how important is the intelligence community to our nation? What would you say? I mean, and what service does it provide?
Well, it's one of the most important aspects of our government, and I think you can see from the situations that the United States has had to deal with that it's a vital part of our ability to protect ourselves and also to understand what is going on in the outside world.
Okay, so up until this time, did you have any interest in foreign policy or understanding international threats, or was this something that just kind of intrigued you and brought you into that community?
No, I started very early. Actually, I remember watching the UN proceedings during the Korean War, and of course I remember a little bit about World War II. I read the newspapers about what was going on, particularly toward the end of the war. So I had a very early interest in what was going on in the world.
So you arrive at NSA, this mysterious place. And what was your first job? You spent your first 12 years in operations, and what was the first thing that you did for them? What were you hired to do?
Well, we had to take tests to see what our talents were and were not. And I remember doing very well on the language tests. And being befuddled by anything involving the computer. So I went into language and spent quite a bit of time with language skills.
Oh, what language did you learn?
Arabic.
Arabic. So you had no background in Arabic prior to that.
No, but I had understood a little bit about some of the problems going on in the Middle East. So I wasn't unfamiliar with some of the Arab issues of the culture and so forth.
Okay.
And I found the language to be very orderly, unlike English.
People often say that English is one of the more difficult languages to learn.
It is.
Because there are no rules. In those early days, what was a typical day like? I'm sure it's so much different than how people would come in and work at NSA today or in any other kind of environment. What was it like?
Well,
what did you do?
It was a paper society. You got papers to work on. You had a grammar book. You had several dictionaries to look up words. You had a gazetteer for place names, that is locations, and you did everything manually. So it was a far cry from today, and it was always very challenging because some of the things that you were trying to look at had a lot of gaps in the information, and you'd be a sentence here without a verb or without a subject, or a gap in the transmission of the information, and you had to try to figure out what might have occurred between the parts that you could exploit and the parts that you could not.
That's interesting. So when you say it was manual, did you actually like handwrite? Is that how you were doing it?
Oh yes, you would write your report out, and then you would send it down to a typing pool. And I was reprimanded any number of times because they couldn't read my handwriting, but there were no typewriters at that point, so it's very much a manual operation.
I probably would have been reprimanded as well.
Hey, Laura, we have a couple of quick questions for Sally as she's starting here. One of the questions is, how did the evolution of women working in intelligence take place? And also, this is a really curious one. Did you have to wear a dress?
That's a great question.
Well, as far as when I entered the workforce, this was just I would say 10 or 15 years before the surge in interest in the workforce by women. It wasn't until the 70s that they were admitted to the service academies. It wasn't, a lot of the top schools, the universities in the countries did not admit women. Although women played a major role in the 20s or the teens during World War I, and certainly during World War II, a lot of them left their jobs after the war was over, went back to raise families. And so there wasn't a real surge in interest in or opportunity, more to the point, for women. Until about the 70s. But there were a lot of women whose skills, and particularly in language and in some other disciplines at NSA, were well appreciated, and so they were able to get very good jobs. They weren't promoted. We weren't promoted particularly quickly because it was still an era before people began to realize that not everybody who showed up without a coat and tie on was smart. As far as the dress was concerned, yes, we wore dresses, and you dressed up. You wore high heels, and pantsuits did not come in until the 70s. And also, yes, it was a very dressy office.
Interesting. Yes, that was a great question because because I don't think a lot of people appreciate that back, there was a time when that's what you wore to work, right? So what did you enjoy most in those early days about your job? What was it that you did that you truly enjoyed?
I love to work on the language. And I loved not having to go to any meetings or answer the telephone. And that's what I enjoyed most. The challenge of trying to work with language that was not well written and full of, as I said, full of gaps.
Mm-hmm. So it was kind of a puzzle, I guess, in some ways, right?
Very much so, yes.
Right. Okay. So you spent your early days there, but then somehow you ended up working at the White House. How do you go from, working as a linguist, and suddenly you find yourself at the White House? How exciting that must have been.
Well, actually, at the same time I was working, I was also going to night school, working on my master's and then on my PhD. And I went to the schools downtown, and actually there were a lot of the adjunct professors were specialists in foreign affairs. So we had diplomats teaching, we had scholars from certain areas, certain countries teaching. So I was working on that aspect, particularly on the Middle East, which is my area of concentration. And then just after I finished my coursework and my dissertation and defending it, I landed in the Situation Room.
That must have been exciting at the time. How did you end up going there? Was it just by chance, or did you?
No, I think that one of the women who was charged with looking at how NSA might make a greater presence downtown, and that is in Washington. Because I had finished a PhD and because I had a regional specialty, she recommended that I be sent down to the Situation Room as an analyst, which is how I got there.
Okay. All right. So tell us about the time when you went there. It was early 70s, right? So, who was in charge? What was it like? How did that work? What was the environment that you had there?
Well, it was the beginning of the end of the Vietnam War. There was a lot of negotiation, a lot of fighting. We had a lot of reports that would come in at 5:30 in the morning because they were coming in from what was then called Saigon, from the military, and it was an update of what had happened militarily overnight. And we would have to use the information we were able to with IBM Selectric typewriters, which the secretaries would operate, to prepare the morning summary to go upstairs to the National Security Advisor. And I'll go into that a little bit more. And then it was also in 1974, the Watergate issue. And that actually started in 72, but then it went on for 4 years. And of course, I did work during the Nixon administration and then in the Ford administration. Again, all the people in the Situation Room were civil servants or military. There were no political people in the sit room.
Interesting. So, so when you had mentioned back about having reports and then going up to the National Security Advisor, what would you like to talk about with that?
Well, it was mostly delivering updated information, what we would call breaking news. If something had happened, I worked part-time, where I worked for Henry Kissinger as a national security advisor, and then he left to go to become the Secretary of State, and General Brent Scowcroft took over as the national security advisor. And we would just take reports up and give it to their admin officer or their secretary to pass along to them. Normally, it didn't require much explanation as to what it was because they were familiar with the topics, but it was just a way of keeping them informed as their day went on about what was happening outside. And that could include not only reports from overseas, but even media reports that something had happened within the confines of the United States, such as an earthquake or a hurricane or something that was breaking news at the time.
That's interesting. So these are both very highly regarded, individuals in our government. Did you get to meet them personally? Did you have that opportunity?
Yes. Henry Kissinger was not what you would call a very outgoing person, but he knew who we were and so forth. On the other hand, General Scowcroft was one of the most important people and was one of the most helpful people I ever met in my career. When we would have crises that were going on and we were staying late at night and so forth, he would come down and thank everybody in the sit room and tell us, how much he appreciated us. Sometimes he appeared in black tie because he had been at a state dinner or something in the midst of a crisis. So General Scowcroft was a very important person as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, very highly regarded. So you mentioned that time after Watergate and during the Watergate time, and that's about the time of the Church Commission, right?
Yes.
And maybe if you could explain a little bit of that. I'm sure some of our students or guests here may not have familiarity with that. If you'd like to talk about that a minute.
Yes, well, the intelligence community got into some trouble in the 70s. The thinking was that they had overreached their legal limits and then gotten into reporting on students. Remember, that was the time that there's a lot of unrest in the country. And the Congress began to investigate the intelligence community and did come up with some issues that the intelligence community had done that were not within the law. So there was a lot of contention at that time, and the Church Committee issued a report, which I think is certainly available online. We were occasionally called by staffers in the Situation Room if they wanted some information, but we really didn't have much to do directly with the Church Commission.
But it did change the way that the Intelligence Committee performed its business from that point on, right? And it still set the standard for today of how that work is done. Okay, and protecting Americans, right? Protecting the rights of Americans, I think, is the important part, the privacy rights of Americans. So you ended up back at the White House situation. You went back to NSA and then ended up back there again. And among that, you became one of started many firsts for women at NSA. And can you talk a little bit about what that would have been? What are the things that you did that you blazed trails for other women?
Well, from the Situation Room, I then went out to CIA for about 6 months, working on the intelligence community staff. And then General Scowcroft asked me to come back as the deputy director of the Sit Room. So I was there for 2 more years. And after that, I was nominated to go to the National War College, which was a 9-month study. and graduated in 1977, and then went back to NSA as the executive assistant to the deputy director. And so that gave me some ability to look at a broad range of issues that the NSA was working on. So I was there for a year, and then I went back into operations. And at that time, which would be in the late 70s, early 80s, the women's movement was beginning to pick up. And so we began to talk about, why the fact that there were so few women in positions of importance. In World War II, there were 3 women in NSA who were outstanding and who became seniors at NSA, that is, people in the highest levels of our agency. But as I say, after the war, there was a lull in that. And then in the 70s, along with the women's movement in other parts of the government and in business and so forth, people began to say, well, that's so 50% of the population. Why aren't they being used, and why are their talents being used? And so on that, with that in mind, women began to be promoted into positions of importance, particularly into managerial positions, which was unfortunately, the way you were promoted was into managerial positions. Even if you had a very rare skill in a difficult subject, that was the way you didn't really get recognized for that so much until later. And then when the technical skills of the agency became better recognized, people were able to stay in their disciplines and still be recognized and promoted. And I think that was a very important thing. And a number of women were in the we eventually called the STEM skills, and were able to be recognized for their talent.
Yes.
Hey, Laura, we have a question going back to the Situation Room. One of the folks wanted to know if, Sally, you were the only woman in the Situation Room besides the secretaries. And if that's the case, how did you handle that, and how did you make sure your influence was felt?
There was, I think, another woman who was looked after some of the filing of the documents, and then, of course, there were 3 secretaries, receptionists in the outer office. It was a very collegial operation. We helped each other out. There were communicators from the military. There were the watch officers mostly from CIA. And so it was a very, I say, comfortable existence. We had no problems. I didn't feel as though that I were being put down in any sense at all.
You do tell a funny story, though. You have told us a funny story about the being one of a few women in the locker room situation and using the locker rooms at the White House.
Oh, actually, that was at the National War College, which is on the list of the historic buildings. It's a beautiful building, but until I think the class of 1975 or maybe 76. No women had ever gone to the National War College. I was in the class of 77, and there were maybe 1 or 2 women, I think from CIA, who preceded me. But they had only 2 restrooms in the entire building that were for women. And they had a gym, which, of course, the military used a lot because they had to keep up their physical fitness. The problem was that to get to the locker room, you had to go through the men's room. And Title IX had just been signed, and women had to be given equal opportunity for the facilities. And so there were 6 members, women in my class, and they called us together and said, now, ladies, if you want to use the gym, we will make sure that the men's room is cleared out and you can go exercise. We said, thanks very much, but we'll work on it ourselves. And so we played tennis, we ran, jogged outside, we did our exercises without having to disrupt everything. But now that has changed. In fact, when I was on the faculty at the National War College 20 years later, they took over one of the large men's rooms and made it into a women's locker room. And before graduation for that class, they invited the entire class and their parents and whatever relatives were there for graduation into the locker room, where they served a few drinks.
So that's interesting. So you were there as one of the first women to ever attend the National War College, and then became faculty there. So that's pretty amazing in itself as well, right? That you were able to do that.
Yeah, that was another tour that I enjoyed very much. We in the 20 years since I had graduated, they had invited foreign students from around the world to attend. And so we, in our seminars, had each would have at least one foreign student. And that was a very enriching experience, which I was not able to enjoy as a student because that was at the height of the Cold War and we just did not have any foreign students at all.
That's interesting too. Very interesting. So if you think about looking back at your time there, what would you say, what were some of the biggest challenges that you saw, both from an operational sense or other challenges you might have experienced?
I think for me, because I did not have a technical background, when I became a manager, I had to learn a lot of things about signals and collection and that sort of thing, which I really didn't know much about. And so I think that was the most difficult thing for me.
Okay.
And managing people, sometimes that can be hard. Some of them are just so easy to work with and others are troubled. And so you have to learn how to deal with that. Now, I didn't have much training in managerial experiences. I think that's changed a lot so that people going into management now have a lot more idea of what they're facing than we did back then.
Interesting. Okay, and then if you think of any of the, you worked a lot in Middle East, you worked some Vietnam, you worked some, it looks like there was some work with a coup in Chile. Is there anything you would want to talk about with any of those that was that you found completely, challenging or interesting?
Well, I think more than Chile was working on the Cold War issues. I think the Soviet Union, and both when I was at the White House, when it began to get into real economic problems, and then they had a series of deaths among the premiers, the presidents, elderly gentlemen who I think within the span of 3 or 4 years, 3 of them died. So it was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union and the rise of Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, who were 2 leaders in the late 80s with whom Ronald Reagan and his administration worked. And then, of course, by the late 80s, I was working in some of the areas involving the Cold War and the demise of the Soviet Union.
Right. Right. Okay. I'm just thinking about, I'm looking at our time. I want to make sure we're mindful of time. So so if there's anything else you would like to share about, your experience, or if there's any other questions that some of the students have, and I know you have a couple books you want to show as well.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions that kind of are linked together. So Sally, this might be an interesting from the perspective since you were back in the 70s period. the question kind of highlights that there were no computers, and so they're wondering, these intelligence reports, did they come via telegraph or phone? And if they did, how long was it really to get an encrypted message? I mean, today it's instantaneous and we take that for granted. But back in the days when you were working in the sit room, if you could kind of maybe share with these students who don't have that experience, because they all have their cell phones, right? Of what that process was of getting things by telegraph, by phone, by encryption, just to kind of give them a little interesting look into those technologies.
Well, actually, we did have computers. When I went down there in 1972, they were not anything like they are today. But we would get our messages, which were sent down from the various agencies. They would come into the basement where the White House Communications Agency would then send them up to the Situation Room. They would appear on a screen, and then the watch officers could distribute them across the street to the National Security Council staff. And that's how most of the information came in. Of course, a lot of it came in from CNN, which was always on because CNN was our indications and warning source. And we also had phone calls. We also had a network. I'm trying to remember what it was called. But we were linked with the other watch offices in the community, including the Pentagon, State Department, CIA, NSA, all the agencies that had a 24-hour watch. And we could get on a conference call and talk about things that were going on, particularly such things as if it occurred in the middle of the night, which a lot of things did, and you got on the horn with everybody else and said, okay, what level are you going to wake up? Are you waking up the secretary, or are you going to wake up a staffer, or what? You never wanted to not wake up a high-ranking individual because it was 3 in the morning, unless nobody else was waking up the Secretary of Defense or State or whatever. So we were able to, we had conference calls. We had what we called the LDX machine, which was a long distance Xeroxing machine. And that's how you sent faxes. So it wasn't a technological jungle at all. And of course, in the 2007 and 8 timeframe, they completely gutted the Situation Room and put in all this new technology, wiring systems, computers, state of the art, everything. And as a matter of fact, all you have to do is Google White House Situation Room, and you'll see pictures of what it looks like now, what it looked like when it was torn up. And I think in this little book I have, which was written by, called Nerve Center by Michael Bone. He was a director of the sit room at one time. He has a couple pictures in there of what it looked like when I was there, which was just a small 3-room place with a conference center, which you see every now and then. Much changed, though, much more on the wall than it used to be.
So Sally, one of our participants is suggested that you should write a book to preserve history, and then would you consider writing about your what you experienced?
I'm too lazy. It's fun to talk about it, but it's a long time ago, and much has been written in the meantime by people who are far more involved in writing than I am right now.
But you have just so much to share. Maybe just write down some notes so it's preserved. maybe not have it published. I'm just going back to see if there's anything else we want to talk about. Oh, no, I know something that's important, and it was important to me in my career. But did you have any mentors? Did you have anybody who was a mentor, or others that you might have considered your group of peers that was important to each others?
Actually, the word didn't come up it wasn't popular when I was a young employee at all. However, I think the woman who never sat me down and said, I'm sending you down to the Situation Room, but she probably in her own way was providing career guidance by telling me to go to the sit room. And then there were a number of men who suggested that I broaden my career by going to the Inspector General's office for a while. And then, of course, I was sent to the War College without ever having applied. So, you know, there was some subtle behind the scenes mentoring going on, but we really didn't have the kind of mentoring that exists now at all.
And amongst that group among senior women, I mean, there were very few at NSA. Did you all team together often, you know, because you had a lot of stories to share, and you know, was there a group of you who would work together to help each other, is the best way to put it?
Yes, in the late 90s, or the mid to late 90s, there were 6 or 7 of us out of the workforce who were senior women. And we did meet periodically, discuss issues about promoting and encouraging women. And we would talk to some of the senior leaders to see what could be done if we thought things were not going the way they should. But yes, it was just a very small group at that time. Now much enlarged.
Because I was a senior, you know, at NSA, and in the 90s there weren't many, and I was aspiring to be a senior executive, but I kind of looked around, was thinking there aren't many. So it has changed so much over the years for the good, right? It was very good. So there's a lot of opportunity there now.
I would like to maybe give you a little bit of information about what goes on in the sit room. I was going to, let me see what time it is, give you some information about the intelligence community, but I think here's a little brochure that's put out by the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. And if you Google AFIO at afio.com, you will find this little booklet down toward the end of the home page on the left-hand side, and you can call it up. It will explain who's in the intelligence community, what each agency does, and if you're interested in a career or in some kind of employment there, how you could prepare yourself, and what you should do and what you should not do, particularly concerning social media and that sort of thing. I would recommend that you have a look at this if you're interested in
Sally, what's that website again?
AFIO, AFIO at afio.com. It's the Association of Former Intelligence Officers.
Okay, thank you, Sally.
It has lots of information, but since we're maybe running out of time a little bit, I'd like to explain a little bit about how the president gets supported within intelligence. Now, mind you, I'm speaking from experience that's, 50 or 60 years old. So every president has a different attitude about how he wants his intelligence. Most of the presidents are briefed early in the morning at the beginning of their business day. Very seldom is a president wakened in the middle of the night. He will not be wakened by a watch officer in the Situation Room. The watch officer will probably wake one of the National Security Council staffers who's an expert on that subject, and then they will decide whether to wake the National Security Advisor, who's the president's national security advisor. But the presidents differ greatly in how much they're interested in national security issues, foreign policy, and so forth. This president, of course, has vast experience, not only in knowing a lot of the world leaders, because he was the vice president for 8 years. He was also the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee earlier on in his Senate career. So President Biden is well versed in that in the community. Another president who was very active in receiving intelligence information was President George H.W. Bush, who had been a director of CIA, and whose son George W. Bush was also very much interested in intelligence. Some other presidents I won't mention would walk around with their reports stuffed in a pocket and not get to them until much later in the day because they were more interested in other things. They were too busy, or they didn't follow their schedules very well, and I won't mention names. And then there's some presidents had no experience or very little with the foreign policy, foreign affairs, national security community. Every president has to get the baptism by fire, usually early in their presidency, by some crisis that takes place. And so they have to pay attention. And as I say, some of them are better at it than others. Some of them like a room with a number of advisors there. They will quiz the briefer, who is often the director of national intelligence, the head of the intelligence community. They will ask questions, which gives the community an idea of what they're really interested in. And so they can take that question back and elaborate on it for the next briefing that takes place. Some presidents write in the margins of things that they want to know about, which is just pure gold to an intelligence analyst. But there are other presidents who just are not that much interested in it.
Yeah, but they should all be interested because it's important. It's important to our nation.
We think they should be, but and I think a lot of them have to become interested because they're just they're in charge, and they have to know what they're doing, and they have to meet with and deal with some opponents, and also with their allies, of whom we have a great many.
Sally, we have a question from some of the students here, and knowing that we're kind of in a mentoring mode here with them, they were asking that assuming in your early career days you may have at times been overwhelmed by the job, or kind of like a new hire would be in their career, what inspired you to keep going, keep learning, and keep developing your professional skills?
I think it was because I found it very interesting. And I would say to anybody, if you have an interest in something, it's never too early to start looking into it, to do some research. And that can be anything from science, the natural sciences, from astronomy to zoology and everything in between, to all sorts of technological interests, of course, mathematics, engineering, those are all, and cyber. You all have, young people have a great opportunity to pursue careers in that, but it's always good to start early. I think it helps you with a lot more things. You're right now feeling a lot more isolated than those of us who are older did, and but I find if you have an interest in something and you pursue it, it overcomes some of the difficulties you're going through right now. And never stop learning. There's always time and room and a necessity for keeping up with what's going on.
That's very true. Mark, are there any other questions? And we can turn it over to Sally for closing thoughts.
One more. It's about your work schedule. When you were down at the White House and in your other ops centers, what were the hours? Were they long hours? Were you working shifts? What was kind of the normal work environment?
Well, for the duty officers, the watch officers, who were the ones who processed and distributed the intelligence information, they had 3 shifts when I was there. I think nowadays they have 5. And by the way, I should tell you now that after 9/11, when Homeland Security and domestic issues became so important, people from DHS are now part of the watchstanders and the analysts. That was not the case. Of course, there was no DHS when I was down there. But there would be 8-hour shifts, I think starting at, well, I can't remember, 7 to 3, 3 to 11, 11 to 7, or whatever they were. My job as an analyst when I first went down there was to prepare the morning brief. And I had to get there about 5 or 5:30 and wait for the information to come in from Vietnam, and then put the morning brief together with the old IBM Selectric typewriter, and take it upstairs to either Dr. Kissinger or to General Scowcroft or their staff. And then I would stay till mid-afternoon, and unless there was something critical going on. I didn't work nights very often, but when there was a crisis, I would just stay on. Other times I came in early afternoon and stayed till about 8 or 9 at night. But if there were a crisis going on, I'd just stay on until whatever time it took. And I do remember in the Watergate era when it was getting to the time that Nixon was going to make a decision, I did stay late because I knew that that night was going to be critical. Mm-hmm. We were, I should say, the night before he resigned, we were locked in the Situation Room, as was the press upstairs. They were indignant of being locked in, but we were just told, please, whatever, get your coffee, and then we're locking the doors. Apparently, President Nixon wanted to just walk around by himself before he resigned the next day. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we saw his, when he talked to the staff in the East Room, everybody was up there when he said goodbye to the staff. So that was very poignant, very sad. Mm-hmm. But an historical day. And then Gerald Ford was sworn in at noon that day as the president crossed the Mississippi River on a flight back to California.
Yeah. Wow. What a fascinating time to be there.
That's all the questions we have, Laura. So over to you.
Yeah, sure. Well, Sally, do you have any closing thoughts for us before we close this session?
No, I think I was going to give you a little bit of information on the intelligence community, but I think because it's all there here if you want to pursue it. It's much better organized than it used to be. We used to have what were known as stovepipes when the FBI wouldn't talk to CIA because it was secret. And then a lot of State Department cables were very sensitive. They were coming in from the ambassador or from the charge d'affaires or from the defense attaché. But I think because of what happened at 9/11, a lot of changes have taken place. It's not perfect. There's still a little bit of withholding information and being a little bit parochial about things. But because of technology and because of the fact that I think the community has now peopled the watch offices around the community with others from other agencies. You have NSA representatives down in the Pentagon Watch Center. You have them out at CIA. You have CIA out at NSA. And so the watch offices are really a representation from a lot of the major community agencies. And that helps.
Right. All right. Well, Mark, and if there's nothing else, then I guess we want to thank you so much for sharing this. It's fascinating. Such a fascinating time, such a fascinating career. And you blazed a trail for so many. And I mean, and the NSA workforce, the intelligence community workforce today is grateful for everything that you did for our nation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would just encourage all of you listening, You can't find a more interesting job than working in intelligence if you want to. It's just fascinating. I think most people who have ever worked in the intelligence community will say that.
Well, Sally, on behalf of the National Cryptologic Foundation, we really appreciate you being our guest today on our cyber chat. And for all the folks who attended today, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing everyone on the next chat. Have a great day.